Did you know that when a narcissist loses an empath, something far deeper than a breakup happens? Not on the surface, not in the arguments, but in the silent spiritual space where the human soul meets truth. Because the moment the empath walks away, a mirror shatters. And when that mirror shatters, the narcissist is left staring at something they have spent their entire life running from. But here is the part most people never understand. This moment is not just loss, it is exposure. You see, the empath in a narcissistic relationship becomes more than a partner. They become the emotional regulator, the silent healer, the one who absorbs pain that was never theirs to carry. The empath senses the wounds beneath the narcissist's behavior, the abandoned child behind the arrogance, the fear beneath the control. And so they give. They give understanding, they give patience, they give emotional oxygen. But what happens when the oxygen disappears? The narcissist suddenly finds themselves alone with something they have spent decades avoiding. If this message speaks to your heart, subscribe now. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave the word healing in the comments and stay with us until the end. When a narcissist loses an empath, something deeply unsettling begins to happen inside them, something that is rarely visible from the outside. On the surface, it may look like anger, indifference, or even quick replacement. But beneath that performance, something far more profound is taking place. The narcissist has lost the emotional mirror that once held their fragile sense of self together. Human beings from the earliest moments of life develop their identity through reflection. A child looks into the face of a caregiver and discovers who they are through the responses they receive. When the caregiver responds with warmth, curiosity, and emotional presence, the child slowly learns that their feelings matter, that their existence has meaning, that they are worthy of connection. This reflection becomes the foundation of a healthy identity. But when that reflection is missing, distorted, or conditional, something inside the child adapts in order to survive. Instead of developing a stable inner sense of self, the person learns to construct a version of themselves that will gain approval, control, or attention. What emerges is not a solid identity, but a carefully maintained image. That image becomes the narcissistic self. The narcissistic self is not built on genuine inner security. It is built on external validation. It requires admiration, attention, and emotional reactions from others in order to stay intact. Without these reflections, the structure begins to feel unstable. It is like a house built on sand that needs constant reinforcement from the outside world. This is where the empath enters the dynamic. Empaths are often highly attuned to emotional signals. They sense pain beneath arrogance, vulnerability beneath anger, and loneliness beneath control. Because of this sensitivity, they respond with patience and understanding. They listen deeply, they reassure, they offer emotional space that allows another person to feel seen. For the narcissist, this becomes incredibly powerful. The empath reflects back an image that stabilizes the narcissist's fragile identity. When the narcissist feels admired, validated, or emotionally supported, their internal discomfort temporarily quiets. The empath becomes a mirror that reflects back the version of themselves the narcissist wants to believe is real. But here is the crucial part. This mirror does more than reflect admiration. It also absorbs emotional chaos. When the narcissist feels insecure, the empath tries to soothe. When the narcissist lashes out, the empath often searches for understanding instead of retaliation. In doing so, they regulate the emotional environment of the relationship. The empath unknowingly becomes the emotional stabilizer for someone who never learned how to stabilize themselves. Over time, the narcissist begins to depend on this reflection. Not consciously, perhaps, but psychologically and emotionally. The empath becomes the source that protects them from confronting the emptiness that exists beneath their carefully constructed identity. So when the empath finally walks away, the mirror disappears. And when that mirror disappears, the narcissist is left without the reflection that once helped maintain their sense of self. This is where the internal disturbance begins. Without the empath reflecting validation, admiration, or emotional reassurance, the narcissist may begin to feel something they have spent their life avoiding, a quiet but unsettling sense of inner instability. It may appear as irritation, restlessness, or sudden anger toward the person who left. But underneath those reactions is something deeper, the loss of emotional regulation that the empath once provided. Many narcissists attempt to solve this quickly by finding another source of reflection, another partner, another admirer, another person who can once again reinforce the identity they depend on. In this way, the search for a new mirror becomes urgent. But the deeper truth remains. The emotional mirror provided by the empath did not heal the narcissist. It simply allowed them to avoid confronting the deeper wounds that shaped their personality. And this is where the psychological tragedy often lies. Because the moment the empath leaves is also the moment when the narcissist is closest to facing the truth of their own inner world. The absence of that emotional reflection creates a brief opening where self-awareness could emerge. The person might begin to question why relationships repeatedly collapse, why people eventually withdraw, why connection feels so unstable. Yet facing these questions requires something profoundly difficult. It requires acknowledging vulnerability, shame, and responsibility. For someone whose identity was built to avoid those feelings, this confrontation can feel almost unbearable. So the mirror is replaced. The pattern continues. But the spiritual reality remains unchanged. The empath was never simply a partner in the narcissist's life. They were the mirror that kept the illusion of stability alive. And when that mirror disappears, the narcissist is left standing alone with the one reflection they have always struggled to face, their own unprotected self. When a narcissist loses an empath, one of the most profound psychological shifts that can occur is the sudden exposure to an inner emptiness they have spent much of their life avoiding. This emptiness is not something that appears overnight. It has usually been present for decades, quietly existing beneath layers of defense, control, and carefully constructed identity. But while the empath remains in the relationship, that emptiness is rarely felt in its full intensity, because the empath's emotional presence constantly fills the space that would otherwise reveal it. Human beings naturally seek connection to regulate their inner world. When we are distressed, overwhelmed, or uncertain, healthy relationships provide comfort and grounding. But for someone with strong narcissistic traits, connection often becomes less about mutual exchange and more about emotional regulation. The narcissist may not consciously understand this, yet they come to rely on others to maintain their internal balance. Attention, admiration, reassurance, and even emotional reactions from others serve as fuel that keeps their fragile sense of self functioning. The silence that follows can feel profoundly uncomfortable for the narcissist. Without the empath's emotional engagement, the environment becomes strangely quiet. The constant reactions, conversations, and emotional exchanges that once filled the relationship are suddenly gone. And in that absence, something unfamiliar begins to surface. Many narcissists experience this not as sadness in the traditional sense, but as restlessness, irritation, or a vague sense that something is wrong. They may feel bored, agitated, or dissatisfied without fully understanding why. This reaction often confuses those around them because from the outside it may appear that the narcissist is simply moving on without concern. Yet internally, the nervous system is encountering emotional states it has long avoided. The emptiness beneath narcissistic behavior is often connected to early experiences of emotional disconnection. Perhaps feelings were dismissed, vulnerability was punished, or affection was conditional. In such environments, the developing child learns that certain parts of themselves are unacceptable or unsafe to express. Instead of integrating those emotions, they are pushed out of awareness. What remains is a hollow space where authentic self-experience should exist. To protect against this painful absence, the narcissistic personality constructs layers of identity designed to create the illusion of strength and certainty. Superiority, control, charm, and sometimes even cruelty become tools that maintain distance from the deeper wound. These behaviors are not simply personality quirks. They are defenses designed to protect the person from encountering the original pain. As long as external validation continues, those defenses remain effective. But when the empath leaves, the validation weakens. The constant emotional engagement that once masked the void is gone, and the narcissist may briefly come closer to feeling what lies underneath. Only genuine self-awareness and emotional healing can transform that inner void. That process requires the narcissist to turn inward, to explore the early wounds that shaped their identity, and to allow vulnerability where defenses once stood. For some individuals, losing an empath becomes the moment that finally reveals the depth of their disconnection. For others, it becomes another event they attempt to outrun by seeking new mirrors and new sources of validation. Either way, the empath's departure removes the illusion that someone else can permanently soothe a wound that must ultimately be faced within. When a narcissist loses an empath, the event does not simply create emotional discomfort. It can open the door to a deeper spiritual crisis. This crisis is rarely recognized for what it truly is, because on the surface it often appears as anger, blame, denial, or quick attempts to move on. Yet beneath those reactions lies something more profound: the sudden disruption of a psychological structure that once protected the person from facing their own unhealed wounds. Every human being carries emotional imprints from early life. These imprints shape how we relate to ourselves and to others. When a child grows up in an environment where emotional needs are consistently met, they gradually develop a sense of safety within themselves. Their identity becomes grounded in authenticity, and relationships become places of mutual support and growth. But when a child grows up in an environment where vulnerability is ignored, shamed, or punished, a different adaptation often forms. Instead of learning that it is safe to feel and express emotions, the child learns to hide them. They discover that being vulnerable may lead to rejection or humiliation. In response, they construct protective layers around their emotional world. These layers can take many forms: control, perfectionism, superiority, or emotional distance. Over time, these defenses become part of the person's identity. The narcissistic personality is often built on such defenses. Beneath the outward confidence and control, there frequently exists a wounded inner self that has been pushed out of awareness. The person learns to survive by maintaining an image of strength while avoiding the deeper emotional pain that once threatened their sense of safety. For many years, this strategy can appear to work. As long as the individual receives admiration, validation, or emotional attention from others, the internal tension remains hidden. Relationships become sources of reinforcement that support the identity they have created. When someone enters their life who offers constant understanding and emotional energy, the illusion of stability grows even stronger. This is where the empath plays such a significant role. Empaths often bring patience, compassion, and emotional sensitivity into relationships. They are capable of seeing pain beneath difficult behavior, and they frequently respond with care rather than judgment. For the narcissist, this creates an environment where their defenses can remain intact. The empath's presence reduces emotional pressure by absorbing conflict and offering reassurance. But while this dynamic may feel like connection on the surface, it also prevents the narcissist from encountering the deeper layers of their own experience. The empath becomes a buffer between the narcissist and the unresolved wounds that shape their personality. When the empath leaves, that buffer disappears. Suddenly, the emotional system of the narcissist begins to experience instability. The familiar patterns of validation and reassurance are no longer available in the same way. Without those external supports, the person may briefly come into contact with feelings that have been buried for years. This moment can create what might be described as a spiritual confrontation. A spiritual crisis does not necessarily involve religion or mystical experiences. Instead, it refers to a disruption in the sense of meaning and identity that a person has relied upon. The structure that once defined who they believe themselves to be begins to feel uncertain. Questions may arise, sometimes consciously, sometimes only as a vague discomfort, about why relationships repeatedly break down, why closeness often turns into conflict, or why genuine connection feels so difficult to sustain. These questions touch the deeper layers of the self. To face them honestly would require the narcissist to acknowledge the pain they have caused others and the emotional distance they maintain within themselves. It would require recognizing that the image they present to the world may not fully reflect their authentic inner experience. This realization can be deeply unsettling because it threatens the protective identity they have relied upon for so long. For this reason, many individuals quickly move away from this moment of crisis. They may redirect their attention toward new relationships, achievements, or distractions that restore their sense of control. By doing so, They rebuild the familiar defenses that keep vulnerability out of awareness. Yet the spiritual significance of the moment remains. The loss of an empath creates a rare opening in which the person stands closer to the truth of their inner world than they might have at any other time. For a brief period, the absence of emotional reinforcement allows deeper feelings to surface. Shame, loneliness, grief and fear, emotions that were once pushed aside, may begin to appear at the edges of awareness. But spiritually speaking, the loss of the empath represents a crossroads. One path leads back to familiar patterns of denial and external validation. The other leads inward, toward self-awareness and the possibility of authentic change. The crisis itself is not the problem. In many ways, it is the invitation. It is the moment when life quietly asks the person whether they are willing to meet themselves without the mask they have worn for so long. When an empath finally separates from a narcissist, something profound often begins to unfold within the empath themselves. What initially feels like heartbreak, confusion, or even failure slowly reveals itself as the beginning of a deep internal awakening. This awakening is not dramatic or sudden. It unfolds quietly, layer by layer, as the empath gradually reconnects with parts of themselves that were suppressed during the relationship. Empaths often enter relationships with a strong capacity for compassion. They sense emotional pain in others and feel a natural urge to respond with care and understanding. This sensitivity can be a beautiful human quality because it allows people to create deep emotional bonds. But in relationships with narcissistic personalities, that same sensitivity can become the very thing that keeps the empath trapped. The empath sees suffering beneath the narcissist's behavior. They notice the insecurity hidden behind arrogance, the loneliness behind control, the wounds beneath the anger. Because of this awareness, the empath often interprets harmful behavior through a lens of empathy rather than self-protection. Instead of recognizing manipulation or emotional neglect as signals to step away, they try harder to understand. This effort can continue for years. The empath listens more deeply, forgives more quickly, and gives more patience than most people would. In many cases, they believe that if they love enough, if they remain compassionate enough, the narcissist will eventually feel safe enough to change. This belief comes from a genuine place of care, but it also carries a quiet cost. Slowly, the empath's emotional energy begins to drain. Their attention shifts almost entirely toward the other person's needs, moods, and reactions. They become hyper-aware of emotional tension, constantly adjusting their behavior to maintain peace. Over time, their own feelings, desires, and boundaries begin to fade into the background. This is where the relationship begins to reshape the empath's identity. Instead of living from their own center, they start living in response to someone else's emotional state. Their nervous system remains on alert, anticipating conflict or criticism. They may feel responsible for keeping the relationship stable, believing that if they just understand more or give more, the connection will improve. But eventually something changes. Perhaps it happens after years of exhaustion. Perhaps a moment of clarity appears during a painful argument or a period of emotional distance. The empath begins to notice that no matter how much compassion they offer, the fundamental pattern remains the same. Their needs remain unmet, their boundaries remain ignored, their energy continues to disappear. This realization can feel devastating at first because it challenges the empath's deepest beliefs about love and loyalty. Walking away from the relationship may bring intense feelings of guilt or self-doubt. They may wonder if they are abandoning someone who needs help or failing to live up to their own values of compassion. Yet this painful decision is often the first step toward awakening. When the empath leaves the narcissistic dynamic, something important begins to happen within their nervous system. The constant pressure of emotional tension slowly begins to ease. Without realizing it at first, they start experiencing moments of quiet that were impossible during the relationship. These moments of quiet allow the empath to hear their own inner voice again. Thoughts that were once suppressed begin to surface. Feelings that were ignored start asking for attention. The empath begins to recognize how much of themselves they had set aside in order to maintain the relationship. This recognition can bring both grief and relief. Grief appears because they understand how much emotional energy They invested in someone who could not return it in a healthy way. They mourned the time, the hope, and the vision of the relationship they believed could exist. But alongside this grief comes a growing sense of clarity. For the first time in a long while, the empath begins to reconnect with their own needs. They start asking questions that once felt impossible. What do I actually want? What makes me feel safe? What does a healthy relationship truly look like? These questions mark the beginning of personal transformation because they shift the empath's focus from rescuing others to understanding themselves. As this process continues, the empath often discovers something remarkable. The compassion they once directed entirely toward the narcissist begins to turn inward. Instead of blaming themselves for the relationship's failure, they begin to see the deeper patterns that shape their choices. Many empaths realize that their intense sensitivity was accompanied by difficulty setting boundaries. They gave freely but rarely protected their own emotional space. Learning boundaries becomes a powerful part of their awakening. They begin to understand that empathy without boundaries can lead to self-abandonment. True compassion must include respect for one's own emotional well-being. Gradually, the empath learns to recognize the difference between supporting someone and losing themselves in another person's struggles. This shift creates a new kind of strength. The empath does not lose their kindness or their ability to care deeply. Instead, their empathy becomes balanced by self-awareness and self-respect. They learn that love should never require the disappearance of their own voice or identity. What once felt like the end of a painful relationship begins to reveal itself as the beginning of a deeper connection with the self. Spiritually and emotionally, the empath moves from a place of constant giving toward a place of inner alignment. They rediscover their intuition, their boundaries, and their sense of worth. And in that rediscovery, they realize that walking away was not the loss they once feared. It was the moment they finally returned to themselves. When a narcissist loses an empath, one of the most undeniable truths emerges. The encounter forces a moment of reality that neither party can escape. For the narcissist, this is often painful, disorienting, and even terrifying. For the empath, it is liberating, clarifying, and transformational. Spiritually, the loss serves as a pivotal crossroads, a point where illusion meets truth, and the forces of avoidance and awakening collide in a way that leaves permanent impressions on both individuals. From the narcissist's perspective, life before the empath's departure was a delicate equilibrium. The empath provided constant emotional fuel, softening the cracks in the narcissist's identity, keeping internal chaos at bay, and offering a reflection of the self they wanted to believe in. That reflection created a sense of control, stability, and security, even if it was built on an illusion. The narcissist often believes that their relationships are about love or companionship, but deep down they are about preservation, the preservation of the image of themselves that feels safest and most powerful. The moment the empath leaves, that image is no longer sustained. Suddenly, the narcissist faces something they have spent years evading: the emptiness, the insecurity, the unresolved pain buried under layers of defense and denial. At first, the narcissist may react with anger or confusion. They might attempt to reclaim the empath, to manipulate, persuade, or punish in order to restore the equilibrium. These behaviors are not random. They are desperate attempts to protect a fragile identity from disintegration. The loss exposes a vulnerability that is normally concealed, and exposure to vulnerability can feel unbearable when the core identity is tied to control, superiority, or invulnerability. Yet, within this exposure lies a rare spiritual opportunity. The narcissist has been shielded from their own inner truth for years, sometimes decades. The empath's presence allowed them to avoid facing the self they had hidden, the abandoned child, the unresolved fear, the suppressed grief. Losing the empath removes that shield. It is a moment when, if the narcissist chooses to look inward rather than outward, a transformation could begin. They might begin to see the patterns of their relationships, recognize the ways they caused pain, and confront the long-buried emotions they have avoided. This confrontation is difficult, often resisted, and for many, never fully realized, but the potential exists because the mirror has been removed. The spiritual contrast between the two experiences is striking. The narcissist faces a mirror of truth they may not want to confront. The empath steps into a mirror that reflects their own strength, autonomy, and clarity. One person is thrust toward potential self-awareness but often resists, while the other is guided toward self-realization with a sense of purpose and freedom. This divergence is critical because it highlights a fundamental law of emotional and spiritual growth. Transformation is impossible without facing truth. The empath's departure forces a confrontation with that truth, but how each individual responds defines their spiritual trajectory. Ultimately, the loss of an empath is not a moment of simple separation. Spiritually, it is a turning point. The narcissist must confront the illusions that have supported their identity for years, while the empath steps into a path of personal reclamation. For the narcissist, the absence of emotional supply exposes the void they have long denied. For the empath, the absence of manipulation and control restores the wholeness they once sacrificed. One path leads toward awakening, the other toward reflection, or, for some, continued avoidance. The ultimate lesson of this dynamic is timeless. Love is not ownership. Compassion does not require self-abandonment, and true growth requires the courage to face reality. When a narcissist loses an empath, the moment is spiritually charged. Illusions dissolve, defensive masks crack, and in the silence that follows, both individuals are given an opportunity to confront truth, one facing the emptiness within, the other rediscovering the fullness of self. It is in this contrast, this separation, that spiritual clarity is born.